Sir class, this is my presentation on the grand strategy of the Roman Empire, based on Edward Luttwak's The Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire from the 1st century AD to the 3rd, which was originally published in 1976. Now this book is noteworthy because its author, Edward Luttwak, is not a trained historian. While he is a specialist in strategic studies, Luttwak's PhD is in international relations, not in history. When this book was first published, it was very controversial because it was among the first to attribute the grand strategy to the Roman Empire. While many historians criticized Luttwak because his analysis was somewhat non-traditional in the fact that he did not rely as much on primary written sources, more recently, many historians have begun to appreciate the valuable insights offered in Luttwak's book. Here's a quick conceptual roadmap for what I'll be talking about today. First, I'll take a look at the historical questions posed in Luttwak's book. Before distinguishing between the content and argument of Luttwak's book, I'm going to quickly clarify his conception of strategy, which is a little bit different from others' definition of strategy, and I'll show how one can discern between the two. I'll then focus on Luttwak's central argument, the evidence he presents, how he analyzes this evidence, and its implications. I'll compare and contrast Luttwak and Farrell's arguments about Roman grand strategy, and I'll present my own conclusions. If you guys have questions, just leave them below in the comments section, or shoot me an email, and I'll respond, given the unique situation of this presentation. So the historical questions that guide Luttwak's book examine to what extent the Roman Empire pursued a grand strategy. Now this is a very important question because before Luttwak's book, many historians questioned whether the Roman Empire pursued a grand strategy at all, whether they simply responded to events as they unfolded. So this book will also examine the extent to which the grand strategy was intentional as opposed to ad hoc, whether the grand strategy was the result of a conscious, deliberate, and reasoned process, or whether it was implied or an inherent grand strategy. This book will also examine the question of whether Roman grand strategy changed over time and space, and if it changed, how it changed. And this last question is important because Luttwak argues that not only did the Romans follow a grand strategy, but that their strategy changed in systematic ways over time. Now, before we can discuss Roman grand strategy, we first have to understand what Luttwak means by the term strategy and how this differs from many historians' definition of strategy. So as we see here, while some historians believe that strategy is transparent and spatial, Luttwak disagrees with this. So what transparent and spatial really means is that strategy has to be explicit, deliberate, thought out. Luttwak disagrees with this. He thinks strategy can be more inductive and doesn't necessarily have to be spatial. So while some historians are going to rely on ancient written sources like Josephus or Vegetius, Luttwak believes that strategy can actually be inferred from archaeological evidence like fortifications and, more importantly, things like troop placements. So in other words, Luttwak believes that we can reconstruct Roman grand strategy by analyzing how they moved their troops across the empire and what sort of archaeological infrastructure they left behind. Luttwak believes it is possible to demonstrate that the Romans followed a grand strategy despite the fact that the Romans left little written record about any grand strategy. So while the Romans did leave written records about various things, there was actually very little written record about Roman grand strategy. So there was no summary of strategic council meetings or a written record of deliberate, thought-out processes with regards to strategy. So in his book, Luttwak looks at the Roman grand strategy from the 1st century AD to the 3rd. Now, this is important because Farrell criticizes Luttwak for ignoring the 4th and 5th century. As we see in Luttwak's thesis here, he does believe that the Romans followed a grand strategy and that this grand strategy evolved in time in 3 distinct stages. Now, Luttwak's book will focus on how these three phases differed from each other based on a variety of factors. By analyzing strategic priorities, Luttwak examines the central goals within each of the security systems over the three phases. By analyzing primary threats, Luttwak shows the most serious security challenges facing the Romans in each of the three security systems. Luttwak pays particular attention to the role of diplomacy and fixed fortifications, how these vary across the different security systems. Using operational methods, Luttwak examines the placement of legions throughout the empire and what such placement implies about the strategic purpose of the legions. And finally, Luttwak believes that each system was designed to serve the interests of different groups of people. So as we'll see later, Luttwak believes some security systems served the provincial elites, while others served the central elites. So the first system was that of the invisible frontier in client-state relations. This took place from Octavian's ascension to power at the end of the Roman Republic up through the death of Nero in 68 CE. So the most influential, some of the most influential emperors during this time were Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius. In this Julio-Claudian system, Roman emperors sought hegemonic expansionism. The primary strategic challenge was internal insurgency as opposed to foreign invasion or external aggression. Under this system, there was no fixed frontier border, and there were very few fortifications. Instead, Rome relied heavily on diplomacy and client states to preserve the outer ring of security. So as we see here, there were three systems of security, and the client kings would preserve this outer layer of security. This is taken from Luttwak's book on page 22. I've included in my slides, which I'll send out to you so you can see in closer detail. The strategy was very cost effective because by relying on client kings to guard the outer ring, Rome was able to keep its legions closer to Rome, could have a smaller standing army, and didn't have to tax its citizens as highly because it had a much smaller army. And of course, this is very good if you're a city resident of Rome because you have lower taxes. Now, Luttwak calls the second system one of preclusive security. It lasted from 69 CE through the mid-3rd century CE. We take a look at some of its most famous emperors here: Vespasian, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. In the system of preclusive security, the most important strategic consideration was territorial security. Rome was most worried about low-intensity infiltrations across the border. Not large-scale foreign invasion, but small groups, very low intensity. So diplomacy plays a role in this time period, but a much smaller role, because the client states provide less of the security and Roman legions are extended out to fixed frontier defenses like Hadrian's Wall over here. Now, while many think that Hadrian's Wall was constructed to keep all the Scots out, Luttwak actually argues that the fortifications, or that walls like Hadrian's Wall, were not designed as defensive strongholds primarily, but as staging areas for operations beyond the border. So this type of strategy served the interest of provincial elites, unlike the third system, which we'll see. So Luttwak's third stage he called defense in depth. This took place in the latter half of the 3rd century, which unfortunately is where Luttwak's book leaves us. Some of the most influential emperors during this time, most notably Constantine. Now, the most important strategic consideration of the defense in depth system was the very survival of the empire itself. Rome was faced with the prospect of large-scale foreign invasion, so fortifications in this time did become fixed strongholds designed to keep invaders out, like the Eberkron fortress in York we see here. In this time period, we see the creation of mobile field armies that were different in both purpose and quality from previous Roman armies. Now, these mobile field armies were akin to modern-day quick reaction forces and had better troops than those stationed permanently on the frontier. If you want to think of this in today's terms, these mobile field armies were similar to the 82nd Airborne Division or 75th Ranger Regiment. And by bringing Rome's best soldiers closer to Rome, taking them from the faraway frontier posts like Hadrian's Wall and bringing them closer to Rome, this strategy served the interests of the central elites instead of the provincial elites. Now, Luttwak's analysis of Roman grand strategy is notably different from Farrell, as you can imagine. Luttwak relies primarily on inferential methods, such as analyzing troop movements and archaeological remains of fortifications. Farrell makes more use of written sources, such as Josephus and Vegetius. They also very notably disagree in their assessment of tactics. So Luttwak says that Roman tactics were almost invariably sound, but not distinctly superior to their foes, while Farrell believes that Roman tactics were the cornerstone of their grand strategy. In fact, this is Farrell's thesis. He says on page 76 of the reading from last night's homework that the cornerstone of Roman grand strategy, at least in imperial times, particularly along the northern frontier, is the tactical superiority of the legions over all their foes. Finally, they differ in their view on the continuity of strategy. So while Luttwak focuses on how strategy varied across time, three distinct stages that I've mentioned, Farrell focuses on how Roman strategy varied across the eastern and western theater. Luttwak is much more focused on time, Farrell much more focused on space for changes in strategy. Now, Luttwak's book is notable for several reasons. His inferential method of analysis makes it possible to discern an implicit strategy in the Roman Empire. His book provides compelling evidence that the Romans implemented a reasoned strategy and that their strategy evolved over time in response to changing strategic priorities. His book illustrates how the role of the Roman legions changed across these three distinct systems of security to face the changing strategic threats. Even though Farrell disagrees with Luttwak and does not share his views on Roman grand strategy, he acknowledges that Luttwak's book is an important one. He calls his book seminal and admits that it set the framework for subsequent discussions of Roman grand strategy. So class, this concludes my presentation. Like I said earlier, if you have any questions, just please leave them below in the comment section or shoot me an email. I will do my best to respond given the unique circumstances we are facing.